In this video, I'm going to briefly walk through the structure of my book, Children in Opera, and mention some of the features. Children were not always considered in the way that modern society does now. While opera was being developed, the concept of a child was basically just one of a smaller adult. Several companies using children as travelling novelty opera acts, two in particular in the 18th century Germany and 19th century Australia, caused the laws to be changed to protect the safety and well-being of child performers. The Jesuits saw opera and education as an ideal vehicle for spreading their message, and many examples of opera sacra, including children. Some of the earliest child opera stars, such as 13-year-old Francesca Caccini, as well as child opera composers from Telemann to Nino Rota, are discussed. In a similar way to Commedia dell'arte, prolific opera composer Francesco Cavalli used a set of stock characters in a double cast. His operas usually included a boy to represent an angel in the mythological world and a page in the human world. As opera spread throughout Europe, the examples of children are varied, from small but pivotal roles such as Amore in Lully's Sieg to entire children-only productions such as the 11-year-old Mozart's Apollo and Hyacinthus. The 19th century saw a proliferation of opera houses to confirm the nationalist pride of many countries throughout the world. These grand buildings mirrored the opera that was gaining in popularity. The use of children was not as prolific at this time. However, the roles that were created represented a new trend of specific casting for the child. The roles were often small and represented the cliché of innocence. As the 19th century progressed, grand opera began to give way to a newer style of realism known as Verismo. Composers were increasingly interested in including children in the chorus structures to help more realistically represent society. Eventually, composers such as Berlioz and Bizet wrote specifically for children's chorus, giving them separate material to the adult sopranos, and this became a popular trend. The 20th century witnessed a major change in the way society viewed the child. In opera, they could reflect the horrors of 2 world wars, depression, and a major pandemic. This loss of innocence provided a profoundly emotional experience for the audience. No example is more visceral than Kruscher's opera Wunderbar, premiered in Theresienstadt and used by the Nazi Party as televised propaganda before the composer and most of the cast were ushered off to the gas chamber. The post-modernist period saw the Eurocentric proliferation of children's roles become far more international. It seemed that from the middle of the century, the floodgates were open, and the huge variety of children's roles were as varied as the music and libretti. The value of children in providing novelty, as well as variety in vocal timbre, mirrored the growing understanding that there was a genuine economic benefit for their inclusion. After Henze used a child in his opera for radio, and Minotti's hugely successful Amal and the Night Visitor was televised in the United States, it was becoming more difficult for directors to cast adults to play children's roles, and composers such as Britten were becoming quite insistent on age-appropriate casting. The next 4 chapters look more closely at 4 of the most prolific composers for children in opera. Starting with César Cui, one of the less celebrated of the Mighty Five, his 4 operas were written entirely for a cast of children and mirrored the European trend of drawing upon traditional children's stories for his libretti. Cui had opened a boarding school and had 2 children of his own. His characters were not one-dimensional page boys, but complex, meaningful young people, and in this way, he was ahead of his time. The characters that Britten created for his operatic children, as well as the music with which he provided them, elevated their involvement to such an extent that he really can be considered the father of children in opera. This shared view is not without its controversy, as Britten worked extremely closely with the boys he wrote for, and often had them stay at his house and even in his bed. Despite this, there is a unanimous acknowledgement from the boys that he was the perfect gentleman and nothing nefarious transpired. The image on the cover of the book is of Miles in Britten's Turn of the Screw. Italian-born American composer Giancarlo Minotti took the baton from Britten and wrote a plethora of memorable operas for children. Chet Allen, who played the first televised child character, would later commit suicide at the age of 45. Minotti and his partner Samuel Barber adopted their own son, Chip Phelan, who also struggled in later life. Minotti's work became increasingly old-fashioned over time, and his distaste for electronic music was ironically seen in his score for Help, Help, the Globalinks. The violin-playing child would save the world from these bizarre alien creatures. Maxwell Davies is often known for his avant-garde scores. However, when he moved to the Orkney Islands in far north Scotland, he was commissioned to write a number of children's operas, which he premiered at several of the local schools. With help from schoolteacher Glenys Hughes, he created 9 short, well-crafted operas which could be successfully produced in the most humble of primary schools. The list of children-only operas is so significant, only a small selection could be chosen for discussion in this chapter. Australian composer Malcolm Williamson wrote 10 extremely short operas for children known as cassations. These could be staged virtually everywhere or anywhere and learned in just a few hours. Jorge Peña-Hen deserves special mention for La Cenicienta. After transforming the youth music scene in Chile and touring with his opera written to be played by his celebrated youth orchestra, he was killed by the Pinochet coup in 1973, ending the life of one of the most passionate activists for youth music the world has ever known. The final chapter discusses where we are now and looks to the future. The age of reality television, internet, underage cybersex, and the inclusion of children in dramatic works for shock value is discussed. I also make recommendations for the delivery of opera in school music programs, making the argument for active participation rather than passive consumption for young people. The book includes a list of around 250 operas that are either discussed in detail or mentioned briefly. I hope it adds to the discussion of this topic and that some of the fascinating stories are as absorbing for the reader as they were for me. For more information, have a look at www.cambridgescholars.com and look for Children in Opera.